It seems to me very clear that President Trump is not intending to waste his second term. What you're seeing now is a very clear intent to deliver the promises that he made, and most importantly, that people voted for. America voted for this. Hi everyone, welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. For those who are watching rather than just listening, you'll see that I'm not in the normal studio in California. I'm actually here in New York at the world headquarters of Fox News, where I've been here this week doing a number of shows you may have seen. And we're now just a week into the new world, the new reality of the president-elect Donald Trump really shaking things up. And I just want to talk a little bit about my reaction to some of the appointments that we've seen already. It's Wednesday, the 13th of November. So this is the afternoon where we've just heard that Matt Gaetz is being nominated by President-elect Trump as his attorney general. So I've got lots of thoughts on that, but I just want to say something overall. It's really exciting. I was just on with Martha MacCallum, and we were just talking about some of these things, Martha MacCallum on Fox News, and she used this term that I think is so appropriate for what we're seeing. She said, it's a reform jolt, what we're seeing. And that is exactly right. That word jolt, I think, really captures the energy that we're seeing. And I think it's fantastic. I've got to be honest. Yes, we can nitpick over this appointment versus that appointment, but taken as a whole, so far, what you're seeing is President Trump absolutely going for it, as it were, and saying, look, I was elected. I have a mandate. I was incredibly clear. Anyone could listen to any of my hundreds of rallies or dozens of rallies, however many there were in total. Every single time he talked about shaking things up in Washington, dealing with the corruption, cutting the federal bureaucracy, cutting back the government, all of the things, right? Cleaning up the corruption in the Department of Justice and the FBI and the lawfare and all these things, right? He didn't hide any of it. And so what you're seeing now is the intent, very clear intent to deliver the promises that he made, and most importantly, that people voted for. America voted for this. There was a really interesting finding on the opinion polls around the election time that not so much the headline numbers of who's up and who's down and who supports us where. It was about the kind of change that people wanted. Remember that going into this election, you had a huge number of people saying the country's on the wrong track. It was like 75-25 wrong track. Big negative numbers for Biden. People wanted a change. And actually, when they were asked what scale of change, what type of change, complete upheaval or modest change, and they're given those choices, the number of people a majority of people wanted the complete upheaval, over 50%, and it was double the number who just wanted a modest change. So this is what people want. People can see, they've seen it for years, especially in the last 4 years, that the government is just not working for them. It's not delivering what they want. And so just an overall comment on these appointments. When you see the reactions you're already getting, and it's going to come in spades with Matt Gaetz. I mean, I'm just seeing the beginnings of that, where people say, the establishment people say, oh, this is terrible. These people aren't qualified for their jobs. They're novices and they don't know what they're doing. And they're not, what do they know about these different roles? That's the whole point. That's the whole point, to get outsiders in. The whole Trump campaign, the theme and the spirit of the campaign and the personnel, it was a band of outsiders, a band of rebels. You saw it. You saw Tulsi Gabbard, who's now been appointed or nominated for Director of National Intelligence, and Matt Gaetz, and there was people on the road with him, RFK Jr., Vivek Ramaswamy, of course, Elon Musk. We'll get to all of that in a second. They ran very clearly as a band of outsiders who were going to go to Washington, D.C. and shake things up. And that famous phrase we heard a lot of in 2016, drain the swamp, this time for real. And of course, if you compare 2016 to what's happening now, it's just night and day. Because as I've said before, in 2016, I think Trump had, he'd never, as he himself said, never spent much time in Washington, didn't really understand the minutiae of how it all worked. And he had this fond belief that he'd just been elected on some very clear promises. He'd go to Washington, deliver the promises. That's how it would be. He was a problem-solving, pragmatic business guy. You say you're going to do something, you do it. Instead, he got there, and he had all these people around him. Most of them were thrust upon him. He didn't choose them personally, not people he knew. And he had all these people, and I know some of the people around him at the time, a lot of the establishment people wanting to control Trump and put guardrails around Trump, all this kind of stuff. So he was saddled with a bunch of people that really he didn't, well, certainly didn't know, but more importantly, who didn't share his vision of shaking things up. And so you had a lot of wasted time. Um, and he's totally learned the lesson of that. And what you're seeing now is the exact opposite. I've got to say, I find it thrilling. I find it energizing. You've got someone who's absolutely clear. I mean, I posted this on X this week, a couple of days ago, and it got a strong reaction. I put it in a modest way. It seems to me very clear that President Trump is not intending to waste his second term, not by a long way. He's really going for it. He's putting in place people who will deliver the agenda that he ran on and which the American people voted for. And a huge part of that is a massive shakeup of a government and a bureaucracy that's been failing for decades and is totally complacent and totally corrupt. It needs a shakeup. And so this is all great stuff. I'm very energized by what we're seeing. Just to sort of talk about a couple of the specific appointments. The first one that was announced, in many ways, the most important because it's the most foundational, his new chief of staff, Susie Wiles. I don't know Susie. I've met her a couple of times. I've seen President Trump with her. I've seen them together at events. And it was always really clear to me, Susie was the campaign manager for this election campaign, that Trump really, really respected her, really listened to her, rated her, respected her. You could just tell from their relationship. And she's very steady, very calm, doesn't seek the limelight, doesn't leak, doesn't do any of that, very low drama, just solid, steady. And that is exactly what he needs in this situation, because there's going to be a lot of drama on the policy front in terms of making the changes that need to be made. That's going to be dramatic, and rightly so. So what you don't want is drama on the personnel side. You want people who just get on with the job. And I think Susie's a fantastic choice for that reason. And by the way, this is from the guy who we were told, do you remember, just before the election, he can't stand having strong, intelligent women around him. Oh, okay, but he chooses the first ever female White House chief of staff. So I thought that was a fantastic start. And some of these appointments are great. I mean, Tom Homan as the board czar, I've known Tom for years. If you watch my Fox News show, you'd know that he's a regular guest. Again, people are reacting to his language, and he says tough things. Yes, he says tough things, but fair and reasonable things, because it's a terrible disaster at the border. It's a humanitarian disaster. And he understands that. He's been there and seen it. And as he said, held dead children in his arms that are dead because of the failure to secure our border and the total takeover of these evil cartels, people smuggling, drug smuggling cartels. He's seen all that. He understands it. And so he's very fired up about it. And it's a fantastic choice. That he's going to get to grips with that. And the also know, and you're already seeing the reaction, incredible positive reaction for all the people who work in the system, who finally see that there's a leader who's going to actually deliver what they want, which is to do their job and secure the border. So I think Tom Homan was fantastic. I do want to single out the new role for Elon and Vivek, Doge, as Elon dubbed it during the campaign, the Department of Government Efficiency. This is fantastic. And I can speak from experience here because I tried and failed to a large extent to implement these kinds of changes when I worked in the government back in the day in 10 Downing Street. One of the things I did was lead our effort to try and cut back regulations and bureaucracy. And I had a small team, and we went about it, you could say, in the traditional manner. And we made an inventory of all the regulations, and we went through everything. We tried to go one by one and change things. And what I found, and it was very apparent after a month or so of doing this, was that you can't do it that way. The bureaucracy will always beat you at that game. If you try and work through, they're always going to beat you if you're trying to win on the basis of paperwork and going through a process. They're better at it. There's more of them, and they're going to beat you. And so my conclusion after that was, there's only one way to really make a dent in this sprawling swamp of government overregulation and bureaucracy and the endless busybodies interfering in every aspect of life. It just seems to get worse and worse, regardless of who's in power. The government seems to grow, the bureaucracy seems to grow, the budget seems to grow. That means our taxes go up. All of this has been one direction only. And my conclusion, and it's not just, as I mentioned, this was back in the UK, same problem there as we have here. And my conclusion was there's only one way through this, and that is to actually shut it down. Right? You can't just reduce the number, massively reduce the number of bureaucrats and the agencies and the departments, just cut them. So they're not there, so they can't do the damage. That was my conclusion. Now, we weren't able to implement that in the UK because, frankly, I didn't have the political backing. I was an advisor. I wasn't the decision maker. I made recommendations. They weren't followed. And so nothing happened. And, 12 years on, it's still a massive problem. Here we have the political backing. Donald Trump wants to see this happen. So that's the first thing I think we need to be clear about, was that if you have people like Vivek and Elon who are going to go in and find what needs to be cut, find and make a recommendation of, here's the departments and the budgets and whatever that need to be reduced and the regulations, we know that Donald Trump will back them up because he wants to see this happen. So that's fantastic. And then looking at those two people, I mean, you couldn't get, both of them so accomplished. They're real, serious, world-class people. Obviously, Elon Musk, all the companies he's built, and a real attention to detail. That's what's so important. Think about some of the stories about Elon when things were going wrong at the Tesla production line. He would go to the production line in the factory and literally with a screwdriver start fixing things and sleep on the floor until it was fixed. He's got this incredible focus and attention to detail. And that's where a lot of this problem is. It's not about grand sweeping statements. Oh, we need to reduce bureaucracy. Okay, what? Which ones? Where? What are the consequences? And being brave enough to say, yeah, there may be some changes that will cause disruption. But in the interest of, our economy and society, we need to make those changes. And so I think that and Vivek as well, incredibly successful entrepreneur, attention to detail. That's what these guys have. And you can see already, just the appointment was announced today, and they're out there crowdsourcing ideas and so on. And there's so many different areas where they can make such a huge difference in terms of the federal government. I mean, it's a combination of things. It's reducing regulations, and it's reducing the size of the bureaucracy itself by eliminating positions, but also eliminating functions. You look at the federal bureaucracy and the whatever you want to call it, the administrative state, the swamp, and so on. You've got so many different overlapping functions. You've got different agencies all kind of interfering in the same way. So if you're on the receiving end of it as a business or whatever, you've got all these different bits of the government poking at you and requiring you to comply with their rules and costly mandates or whatever it may be. And so a huge part of it is just cutting all that back. Another big part of it, which is part of their remit, is finding the better uses for, even commercial uses for, the huge portfolio of government assets. The federal government owns land and buildings and so on. A lot of that is being wasted. So that could be a bringing in money straight away, which helps with this massive debt and deficit that we have. The efficiency, the fraud, the waste, the abuse. There's so many different things going on here. And then the final point I'd make is that one of the things I've really loved about the announcement, not a lot of people have spotted this. If you read the actual announcement from President-elect Trump, right at the end, it says, this work, Vivek and Elon's work, will conclude no later than July the 4th, 2026. I'm paraphrasing now, which will be the perfect birthday present to America on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. What I love about that is making something time limited so that this doesn't end up being another sprawling bureaucracy that develops a life of its own and just keeps going on and on forever. No, you've got 2 years to figure it out. I love that. That's real accountability. And so I just think when you look at all these changes and then, you look at the outsiders coming into these different departments, I'll just say a quick word about Tulsi Gabbard and then I'll conclude with that case. Tulsi Gabbard is a friend of mine. I've known her for years. I first met her when she was actually part of the Bernie Sanders campaign, because she really is an anti-establishment person. She is an outsider. That's how I first came across her. She was actually very focused on the corruption in Washington. I remember having her on my Fox News show, I think before anyone else on Fox put her on. So I've known Tulsi for years. She's fantastic, knows what she's talking about. Of course, she's, in the military now. And so she's someone who really cares about the country and has a really strong sense of right and wrong and justice. And one of the things I just think we need to get ready for and she knows this. These awful smears that are going to come her way about how she's a Russian asset and all the rest of it. I always used to say to her when she came on the show, "Aloha, Tulsi." Obviously, she's from Hawaii, represented Hawaii in Congress, but it's more than just a greeting. That sense of what aloha means, that aloha spirit, she really wants to see peace in America and in the world. That's what she's motivated by. And so that's why she's done some of the things that were controversial, like trying to, to get some progress in the Middle East with Assad and so on. And that's the true motivation. And to smear her on the basis of that and call her a Russian asset, as she's been called, is really, really despicable. She is a real patriot. And so I think that is great. She's been very, very much part of the Trump campaign. And I'm really happy that she's been rewarded with a really meaty role. And then let's talk about Matt Gaetz, because that's the big one that is just going to already making people's heads explode. I've just had an hour or so since the announcement was made. As I'm taping this for you, I've been on talking about it. And I'll just say what I think, which is that Matt Gaetz is a very smart person. Okay, I know he's got a reputation as a firebrand, a bomb thrower, whatever term you want to use, and he plays up to that. But I know because, again, I've known him for years. He was a guest on my show. I'll tell you a story. He was one of the times he was on the show. I think maybe the first time. I think it must have been the first time. And he was talking about, we booked him to talk about a particular political issue. And then in the ad break, I was just chatting to him about what we were going to be talking about next, which is one of our policy conversations. I think it was about healthcare policy. And he immediately responded with a bunch of incredibly smart points about the insurance industry and how corrupt it was, and they fund members of Congress, and that's why nothing ever changes. All this kind of stuff. Really smart, thoughtful observations coming again from like Tulsi, an anti-establishment perspective. This, you call it anti-establishment, call it populist, whatever. I thought that was brilliant. So I said, "Stay, Matt, and let's talk about it." And he stayed for the rest of the show. He's a much deeper policy thinker than he lets on. And if there's any place in our federal government that really needs a cleaning house and shake up, it is the Department of Justice, and specifically the FBI. Because you look at what happened with the FBI in the 2020 election, an absolute disgrace. And it's astonishing to me that there's still no accountability for that. You had the FBI, with Christopher Wray, the director, presiding over it, interfere in the 2020 election to help elect Joe Biden. There's no doubt about that. There's no other way of describing it. They interfered in the election. And specifically, it was about the evidence of Joe Biden's corruption that was contained, of course, on the Hunter Biden laptop. But the reason the laptop story was relevant and important in the election was it revealed the grift and the corruption that Joe Biden and his family had been engaged in while he was vice president. So highly important information for the election that could have been damaging. Polls suggest that it could have swung the election. I don't know about that. But there's no question that it would have been very damaging. That's why they tried to hush it up. And we know the facts here. I mean, I'm going to do a whole piece. You can look it up when I've spoken about this. But the bare facts are that the FBI knew the Hunter Biden laptop was real and that it was Hunter Biden's because they had it in their possession for months. They'd had it since the year before the election. So then, in the run-up to the election, when they found out that Rudy Giuliani had it, because they were tapping his phone and spying on him for a separate investigation, they found out that he was talking to Miranda Devine from the New York Post, and so they thought, oh, this thing's going to get out. That's when they went into action. And they then went to the tech companies and said, there's going to be a dump of Russian disinformation. They even said the date, because they heard Rudy Giuliani and Miranda Devine talking, and they said it's going to be October. They had a date in mind for when it'd be published. So the FBI told the tech companies it's coming in October, and it's going to be something to do with Hunter Biden, and it's Russian disinformation. Be on the lookout for it. And so then and Mark Zuckerberg said, when we saw it emerge, it was exactly in line with what we'd been warned about. So of course we shut it down because that's what they told us to do. The whole thing was engineered by the FBI. So the only question is this: Christopher Wray was head of the FBI when all this happened. Either he knew about it and was okay with it, which is outrageous, or he directed it himself as an operation, which is even more outrageous, or he didn't know anything about it, in which case he's presiding over rogue elements within his own agency that interfere in an election. Any of those possibilities is, and there are no other possibilities, any of those possibilities is completely unacceptable. He should have been fired long ago. And so it's an example of how you do need someone like Matt Gaetz in there to shake things up, because people can say pompously, well, he's not like, like a sort of revered legal expert or whatever. And, Merrick Garland was nominated for the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what's happened to the Justice Department and the reputation of justice in this country since Merrick Garland's been presiding over the Department of Justice? It's completely collapsed. Faith in our justice system has collapsed when you have these respected insiders in charge. So why not try an outsider who's really going to shake things up? That is my view on that. And broadly, that's my view on all of these changes. It is time to shake things up. People want to shake things up. That's what they voted for. And it's incredibly encouraging. More than that, it's exciting to see the energy that President-elect Trump is bringing with these amazingly interesting appointments that all point in one direction, that he's determined to act on the mandate that he was given, to do it quickly and to make the change happen that people voted for last week. All right, joining us for California Corner, it's Susan Shelley. Susan, we did our post-election show last week with all the gang, but now the things are really happening. There's moves. President Trump obviously making a lot of moves, President-elect Trump, I should say. But also on the California front, Gavin Newsom's been very busy. CARB has been very busy. We've talked about this before. We'll get to that in a minute. They took the opportunity of waiting till the election was over to raise our gas prices again. I want to really dig into that with you and really understand what's been going on. But first, bring us up to date on what Newsom has been up to in response to this election result.
Well, Governor Newsom got on a plane and flew to Washington and met with the president, Joe Biden, and some of his staff, and also with congressional Democrats. And he is trying to get approval for a lot of waivers from the Clean Air Act that California needs in order to implement a bunch of its rules. The way this works is California has the right under the law to have its own stringent air quality rules. But each of these regulations needs a federal waiver, and they have to be justified on the basis of a compelling need for them. And also they have to be technically feasible, and there has to be a certain amount of manufacturing lead time. So they don't just go into effect, but you wouldn't know that in California because the governor will sign these things, then CARB will, and they will issue these regulations, and they'll say absolutely no gas-powered leaf blowers, and no gas-powered lawnmowers, and no gas-powered ferry boats, and no gas-powered construction equipment. And they have all electric cars is a new regulation. You won't be able to sell gas-powered cars after, I think, 2035, and clean trucks have to be implemented at something like the same schedule. None of these can go into effect without a federal waiver. The interesting part of this is that the Biden administration has not granted these waivers in 4 years. Some of them have been waiting that long. They have not granted these waivers. Well, now Governor Newsom is in Washington trying to get a hurry-up decision to grant them so that the Trump administration, when it comes in, has to at least go to some trouble and delay and maybe be sued for trying to reverse them. If they're not approved by the time Biden leaves office, the Trump administration can just deny them. And that means that they can't go into effect. So goodbye to the ban on selling gas-powered cars and gas-powered trucks, and the requirement to phase out diesel locomotives, and all of these things that have this tremendous cost. All of these come from the California Air Resources Board, CARB, and they're all part of implementing these standards that the legislature passed, demanding a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, no matter the cost.
Is that what's it called? The Climate Change Solutions Act or whatever?
This is the Global Warming Solutions
Global
Act
warming.
from
I'm sorry.
2006. Yes.
Yes. So right.
Yeah.
So let's just. This is so fascinating because I have to say I didn't quite see how all these pieces fit together until you just laid it out. So you have the initial legislation that kind of sets up a framework, and
Right.
then you have CARB, the agency that then issues rules. But all of these specific rules and regulations are permissible in California because of this carve out from what is it?
The Clean Air Act.
Clean Air Act, right? So you can set your own standard in California. But I didn't realize that each one of these has to be explicitly approved, as it were, by the federal government.
I didn't realize it either until Governor Newsom got on a plane to try to get these things approved. And it was interesting that the Biden administration has not done so. CARB is justifying these. They have to be cost effective. And CARB justifies them by coming up with these numbers, which are, I don't know if the science behind these numbers has been adequately scrutinized for the economic damage that is caused by these regulators. For instance, the ban on leaf blowers is justified as preventing 887 premature deaths and providing $9 billion in public health benefits.
Oh, it's such,
Where,
yes.
how, what?
Well,
This
it's
is
just, I mean, funnily enough, I've seen all this. I mean, I remember studying this in at Oxford. Part of my economics degree. I did PP, philosophy, politics, and economics. Part of the economics stuff was a course called public economics. Within that, we had a section called cost benefit analysis, and this is how governments, it's not limited to governments, but it's a tool that governments use, bureaucrats use to evaluate different policy options. And in a sense, it makes sense. Like, if we did this, what are the costs? What are the benefits? It's kind of obvious. But one of the things that they do is make stuff up in order to try and make sense of a decision that's essentially political or ideological. And so one of the things that they make up is they put a financial value on a human life, or the length of it. And they have all these they assign numeric values to things that actually are just sort of impossible to evaluate in that way. But they do it in order to make some calculation that gives it the appearance of scientific rationality, whereas actually it's just a political decision or an ideological one. And
right.
this is a perfect example of that. And I know from having studied all this and done it, you can put whatever numbers you want in there to get whatever outcome you want. And that's clearly what's going on here. Can I just ask about the leaf blowers? I thought that was already a ban that was in place.
Maybe
The garden equipment.
they implemented one of the 8, and that might be the one. I'm not sure. I couldn't find that detail. But the advanced clean cars rule, that doesn't take effect yet. And the clean fleets for trucks, that doesn't take effect yet. We have a ban coming up on transportation refrigeration units. So a refrigeration unit that goes in a truck has a diesel engine, and that would be banned. And diesel locomotives would be phased out.
I was hearing about that from when I was talking to farmers in the Central Valley. That's a huge impact there. That's going to really affect them because you have to have battery, you can transport a fraction of what you can. I mean, all these things are so disruptive, and they're not going to, and they're all justified. I mean, going right back to the origin of it, the global warming solutions. This will make no impact at all on global temperatures. None. It's just total ideologically driven. I mean, it's self-destructive madness. But it sounds like we may be saved because by all things, the Biden administration, if they're not going to issue these waivers.
Isn't that interesting? And then the Trump administration, we know from the first Trump administration that President Trump did not favor California having this waiver and essentially disrupting the whole auto industry. Because ultimately what happens is it just makes everything more expensive. They create an impossible standard, and then they'll allow you to buy your way out of it somehow. You can buy credits from companies that make electric cars, and they can make more money selling the credits than the cars. And the bottom line is the consumer pays for everything. And this is very troubling. And, the problem with this is when you make everything more expensive and you stop people from being able to drive to work because you price them out of buying a car and operating a car, poverty is the result. Poverty has its own health risks.
Of course.
And they're not weighing that. Elected officials should be weighing the whole picture here. They should be weighing the cost of living against these so-called health benefits of these regulations. But once again, they're doing the bait and switch. They're talking about climate, and then they're switching it to so-called health risks.
Yes, so they're trying to justify it on because the truth is it's ideological.
Exactly.
There's no practical justification for it. It's not going to affect the climate. It's not going to lower global temperatures. It's not going to affect all the things when they dress it up, they say, oh, wildfires and floods and hurricanes. No, it's going to have zero impact on any of that. All it's going to do, as you said, is make people poorer, make life more difficult, in particular for the poorest and for small businesses and so on. And the thing just to inject a bit of politics into it, what's amazing is that, and I've been saying this, people may have seen me say it a lot over the last week or so. Yes, there are some Democrats who are looking at last week's election result and saying, look, we've got to, really reset where we are. We've gone too far left. We need to be a bit, there's a small number are saying that. We've lost the working class. This is a serious issue. But in California, there's none of that. They're actually doubling down on the exact same policy agenda, this combination of elitism and extremism that is driving working class people away in the first place. And in California, saying, yeah, we'll have more of that. It's just crazy.
Yes, it is. It is crazy. And they always revert to saying something like climate change is an existential threat.
I know.
Even if you believe that, what we're doing in California has no effect on it.
Has no effect. So even exactly, and that, I always say, like, if you really believe it, then you'd open up our oil, drilling in California and stop importing it on these giant super tankers, because that's actually adding to carbon emissions. But it's not about that. It's about sort of showing that they're fighting fossil fuels. But in terms of these calculations, and the reason, it goes back to what I was saying about cost benefit analysis. The reason that they're not putting in the health impacts of making people poorer is because they want the calculation to come out a certain way. And so if they did a truthful cost benefit analysis, you wouldn't do this policy. But that's not, they don't want it to be truthful. They want it to justify their prior ideological position. But can I just, this is really interesting to me because I hadn't appreciated, it sounds like, because of this waivers point, that even the ban on gas cars, like Trump said he would overturn that. And as he was saying that, as he's been saying that, I thought to myself, well, he can't, can he? It's a California thing. Sounds like he can.
Yes, he can. He can. He can say that California can't have this waiver. Even if the Biden administration was to enact a rule that created this waiver and allowed it, any rule can be changed by the incoming administration. It's just a question of how long it takes. And as we know, the governor has called a special session to try and get more money for lawsuits against the Trump administration. You can bet that this is what they'll be suing over, to try and save these so-called climate waivers. But it's just a giant tax on the people of California. And I think if people clue into that, the popularity of this whole scheme will fall away in an instant. When people see the real price tag and they recognize that these regulations don't have to be there and other states aren't doing this, and that's why things are less expensive there. When they put that together, this is going to change very quickly.
I mean, the left wings, the Democrat-run states, some of them are doing it. I think I saw there are 14 states that have copied some of the things that we're doing here in California. But what is interesting? I mean, it's an interesting one for me because I've always been such a strong advocate of decentralizing power. The 10th Amendment, power should reside with the states, and so in a way, part of me is torn here because I think, in terms of first principles, yeah, California, if we want to have more strict or loose environmental regulations in California, we should be able to do that. That's what the decentralization of, that's what a federal system is all about. On the other hand, when you have terrible policy coming out of Sacramento and it's overruled by Washington, in a practical sense, that's a good thing.
Well, you do have the Interstate Commerce Clause where the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. And when you're talking about companies that sell cars in all 50 states, it has an effect on them if the California market and several other states that follow it want their own standard. It winds up raising the costs for everybody. And so there are federal issues that come into that. But I guess the courts will have to sort out which is which.
So it's interesting. So Newsom, so that was the reason he came, or the ostensible reason to DC, went to DC, was to expedite these specific
These waivers,
waivers.
yes. And there were a couple of other things that he wants done before Biden leaves office. He wants some funding for COVID emergency relief. Apparently, California's $5 billion or so in the hole, and he wants federal reimbursement for additional COVID spending. I'm not sure exactly, but some sort of emergency COVID
It's outrageous,
spending.
isn't it? We had like $100 billion surplus a couple of years ago. Now look, they're begging for money from the federal
Exactly.
government. It's outrageous, actually.
Yes, and I think he wants a waiver so that he can do certain kinds of mental health treatment in the community settings and get Medicaid reimbursement for it, or Medi-Cal reimbursement. He wants some kind of a waiver for that, not for institutional settings, but something he wants to do that needs a waiver.
So it's not the sensible one which you first alerted me to, the
Right.
16 bed rule. It's not that.
It's not that. It's something
Okay.
having to do with community settings. He was very vague. He wouldn't be specific. He just kept saying, "We need the waivers," and, you know, he said, "I wanna keep it high level." That's what he said when he was asked by, reporters. He wouldn't get into the details.
Yeah, it's a sort of tendency, I think, to keep it high level and not bother with the details, because the details turn out not to be very good.
To be
Um,
good for the Democrats.
so let's move on to another tax. I mentioned at the top, we've got this announcement on Friday, late in the night on Friday. There's a lot of speculation about where this would go and the run up. It was CARB again making their ruling on the low carbon fuel standard. LCFS is the acronym.
Yes.
We've talked about it before, but in case people didn't see that, well, now it's real, right? They've announced what's going to happen. So just talk about the subs. We'll get into the fact that it was late and all the rest of it, and they're trying to cover it up. But just remind us the substance. What's the policy here, and what's going to actually happen?
Well, what California has done is set up a scheme of subsidies and penalties to try and get people off of petroleum products through economic hardship. That's really what this is. And they've got this immense technical boondoggle, I'm going to call it, where they assign carbon density values to different types of fuel. And then there are credits generated for something like biodiesel. And then there are penalties for petroleum products. So a company that is selling gasoline and jet fuel and diesel fuel has to buy credits from companies that make energy from cow poop mixed with your tax dollars. And so the money is changing hands to subsidize the cow poop company in order to keep them in business.
Is the government in the middle of that, or do you pay a tax and it's redistributed?
No, I think this is a so-called market that they've created, but it only exists because they're requiring the oil companies to buy these credits through this rule, which is called the low carbon fuel standard. That's what this is. So they tinker with the numbers because they're well aware, and they've discovered this year, that if it adds too much to the cost of gasoline, people notice and they're not happy. And they call the legislature, and then the legislators say things like, "We have concerns about what CARB is doing." If they really had concerns, they would pause these targets that are driving the regulations, or they would repeal them because they're not doing any good anyway. But that would disrupt the so-called market in cow poop energy and all the rest of it, because there are people who are invested in that and they're counting on this revenue from credits. That's part of their business model. If CARB didn't vote for this rule on Friday, it would have been too late. They would have had to start their rule-making process all over again. It would have been 2 years before they had new prices for the credits, which these companies were banking on. That's what's going on here. This is subsidies for things that the market has rejected, paid for by people who are buying gasoline, diesel, and everything that's made or moved by a truck in California.
But it's a fake market, isn't it?
Yes,
It's all manufactured. This is totally engineered by the government. It's not real,
exactly. Right.
and
And
it's
that's what the rule was deciding, is who's going to get the credits, who's going to pay the price for the credits, what are we giving carbon density allotments to, assignments to? It's a bunch of nonsense. It's just subsidies and penalties.
it's a complete bureaucracy run amok, isn't it? It's just
Yes, it is. And all to implement this regulation, this law from 2006, this law that says we must go, whatever it was, to 90% below 1990 levels, or 40% below 90, whatever numbers. They've changed them a few times. But the idea is you have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. CARB is assigned to find a way to do that. They invented two different programs, the cap and trade program and the low carbon fuel standard, and they are both raising the price of transportation fuels.
this happened under Arnold, didn't it? The
Yes, it
low
did.
carbon.
He signed the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2006, which was AB 32, Assembly Bill 32 at the time. And then the rest of it was just done by the regulators to implement these impossible standards.
So the low carbon fuel standard was in that legislation,
No,
and
I think it was invented by CARB
I see.
as part
So
of their
the
project that they're
legislation
doing
was
about.
enabling, and then they went and did it.
Right. The
Which is again
legislation set
another
the
example.
project.
It's totally outrageous how these unaccountable bureaucracies are doing such, massive and consequential things without any real, you know, democratic accountability. So, what is the actual consequence? There's this number that, I've shared article. The number that was put out there is going to raise gas prices next year by 65 cents a gallon. Is that right?
It could be. I don't think anybody really knows because it depends on how much the credits are selling for, what the demand is for gasoline, how much they have to pay for the amount of gasoline they're manufacturing and producing. I'm not really sure if anyone knows exactly what the dollar amount will be, but it's currently about 10 cents, estimated at about 10 cents of what you pay for a gallon of gas. And last September, CARB estimated it would add 47 cents a gallon. And then they withdrew that estimate when there was political heat, did not release another estimate, and they're trying not to answer the question. But nobody really knows. And it's all on autopilot once this gets started.
That's what's so amazing about it. This is that's a big number if it ends up being that per gallon.
It sure is. And it affects people who live in the Inland Empire and have to drive to work, and anybody who has to go a long distance to work or works with a pickup truck where you're driving from job to job and gasoline is part of your expense. It's going to wreck your business. It's going to cause poverty. And poverty is very deadly. It's more deadly than these diesel fumes that they're imagining.
I mean, it's almost doubling the tax,
Hmm.
isn't it?
Yes, it
Okay,
is.
when you look at the total government imposed, how much of what you pay per gallon in California is the direct result of government taxes and regulations. I've seen a number of around 140 or something
Mhm.
total.
It's certainly more than other states are paying.
It's insane. And they put it through, and so the reason they can't be specific is because they don't know yet who's going to buy. I mean, what's the variable here?
Well, the variable is, let's say Chevron has to produce X number of gallons of gasoline for the market, but then there's a recession and the demand is lower, so they don't need as much, so they don't have to pay for as many credits. There are a bunch of different factors that go into exactly how many credits they have to buy and how many companies are making biodiesel or cow poop energy or whatever they're doing that gets a credit generated that they can sell. That affects the market is what the supply and demand is of each of these.
It's just unbelievable. And it's all, I mean, you might as well just be honest about it and just say, well, here's a tax, we're putting it on, and then we're going to give the money in subsidies, but they've created this whole complicated bureaucracy of,
Right.
of pretending to have a market that's not real in
Right.
order to try and disguise the fact that this is just good old fashioned taxing and subsidizing.
Right. Well, it conceals the responsibility, so
Yeah.
the lawmakers do not have to take accountability for what they're doing. And one of the interesting things about this most recent political storm is that Chevron and I think some of the other energy companies have been leaking documents to reporters and explaining what this is. And they want the government to be accountable for what it is doing. And the government is trying to point the finger of blame at the oil companies. And this is quite the public relations war, but the truth of the matter is that it's the government that is causing California to pay more for energy than people in other states. The oil companies operate in all 50 states. Only California has these stupid rules that make everything more expensive here. And what does it accomplish? Nothing.
And they're doubling down on it. That's what's so amazing. Oh, all right. Susan, thank you for explaining all that. That was great. I mean, there's no end to it, is there? I mean, the end is going to be when we replicate the national election result here in California and actually have real political change. That's what we need to see,
That
because
is
there's absolutely no sign that California Democrats have learned anything from the victory for not just Trump, but the multiracial working class coalition, that idea that's so strongly part of how last week was, seen, and the reality of what it was. They don't seem to care about that at all.
Well, if President Trump cancels some of these regulations and costs come down, he may be much more popular in California than
Exactly.
anyone in Democratic politics would believe possible.
That's a brilliant point, actually. That's a brilliant point, because everyone's saying, oh, in California, I hear a lot of people say, well, he's so unpopular and there'll be a midterm backlash against Trump. But actually, if he does things, if he's saving Californians, especially working class Californians, from the worst effects of these far left policies, then, that's something.
It sure is. It would bring down the cost of food. It would bring down the cost of your air conditioning. It would bring down the cost of cars. There's a lot to like about canceling stupid regulations.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's why I'm so excited about Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon and Vivek. I spoke about that earlier. We definitely need one of those here in California.
Yes, we do.
All right, Susan, thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, I'd like to finish with one more thing about the changes that we're seeing at the federal level and from Donald Trump and the appointments and so on. It's not related to a specific appointment. It's a specific idea that he's talked about, and we'll see if it happens. As of the moment I'm taping this, we haven't heard anything. I'm talking about the Department of Education. So he said for a long time, very clearly, we're going to abolish the Department of Education. That's something I totally agree with. Why? Because as you know, if you followed me for years or you've read my books, that idea of decentralizing power, of putting power in people's hands, putting it as close as possible to people is the central idea that my work has been focused on. The books I've written, the work that I've done in politics and government and policy, and to a certain extent, even the tech startup that I founded, Crowdpack, which is all about decentralizing and democratizing the process of running for office. So that idea is central. And what we've seen in the last, few decades, more than that, actually almost the last century, I think it goes back to really since the Second World War, is a growing centralization of power in America, taking power over more and more things and centralizing them in the federal government in Washington. Education, of course, which is a recent creation. It was Jimmy Carter. It was I think first authorized in 1979, created in 1980, that kind of thing. So it's recent, but it's just one example. We've had this incredible centralization of power. And as that's happened, what's happened? The government's become more costly and it's become less responsive to people's needs. They're less satisfied with their government. There's less faith in government. And it's all just this bureaucratic mess. And so a big part of it is not just as we were talking about earlier with what Elon and Vivek are doing, reducing regulations and so on, and cleaning up the different agencies. It's actually shutting down huge parts of the federal government and putting the power back where it belongs, which is, and now I'm going to quote from my favorite amendment to the Constitution. We hear all the time about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. The one I cherish is the 10th Amendment, which states that the powers not specifically in the Constitution, quote, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so that amendment, the 10th Amendment, has been completely blown through over the years because none of this stuff that we see now run out of Washington, D.C. is specified in the Constitution. Education is an example of that. But my response to getting rid of the Department of Education, we haven't seen an announcement on that yet, but my response would be, why stop there? There's a whole bunch of other ones that we can get rid of as well, should get rid of, because they are unconstitutional. The power should be held closer to where it's exercised at the state level or the local level. Now, just to be clear, and I wrote this in I've written a couple of times in my books, if you believe in decentralization, you shouldn't be an extremist about it. You shouldn't be an ideologue about it. You don't, there are certain things that clearly make sense to be handled at a national level. We are the United States of America. We are one nation. And so we do need, of course we do, a national military defense forces. And so we need the border, the immigration makes sense to be run at the national level. We're one country. Some aspects of environmental regulation, because pollution doesn't stay above state borders, transportation, etc. So there clearly are things that are appropriate for the federal government to get involved in, the currency, relations with foreign countries, etc., etc. So there's not some extremist argument about we got to shut down all of the federal government. No, that's ridiculous. We've got to be sensible, apply common sense. So when we do apply common sense, look at some of these things. Like, why is there a Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington, HUD? Like, what's that about? How, if there's anything that obviously is clearly limited to what happens within a state, surely it's housing and urban development. Why on earth is Washington getting involved in any of that? It's ridiculous to me. And you can go down the list. Things like welfare and healthcare and so on. The whole point of the states was to be, in Brandeis's words, the laboratories of democracy. Try things out, see what happens. The beauty of that you saw in the pandemic, where you had different responses in different states, so we could see what worked best and what was bad, and and the people could then vote, and that's been a big part of the vote with their feet and leave the states with the lockdowns and move to places like Florida, where They had a different attitude, and you could see the difference. And that should apply to so many of these areas of policy. It's completely ridiculous, for example, that, I mean, if you listen to the episode of the Big Ideas Book Club a few months ago with Michelle Steve talking about homelessness, the fact that so much of what California does on homelessness is directed by the federal government is ridiculous. So the thing that I would like to see is not just the closing down of the Department of Education, but applying that principle right across the board with a default assumption that, and this is the principle that is known as subsidiarity, that you should devolve power wherever possible. And so only things that have to be dealt with at the national level should actually be a responsibility of the federal government. If we can make that change happen this time with Trump at the helm and people like Elon and Vivek at his side, it's going to be an absolute revolution and going to be fantastic for the real truth about what we want to see here, which is better results from our government that create a platform for people to pursue the American dream. All right, that was our show for today. I'll say goodbye from New York City. I'm heading to DC, to the swamp tomorrow. I'll be there on Thursday. We'll see you back here. I'll be in California back next week for our normal episode of The Steve Hilton Show. Make sure you follow us on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you again next week.